Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Infrastructure Lab event today on a sunny day. And so this discussion is a Canada-US infrastructure exchange on the road to transit electrification, and the timing is quite good given the announcements in Canada yesterday. So the Infrastructure Lab, just to give it a bit of background, is a forum set up by Global Public Affairs to really promote dialogue and share some of the experiences from experts across a number of fields. And we're fortunate to have a number of those experts here today in the transit electrification field. And our focus really is to sort of deliver value from the infrastructure investments that are going on. So thank you all that have joined today for giving up your time to join this webinar, but also to our excellent group of panelists for giving up your time and sharing your insights around this important and interesting topic. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We want to sort of keep this dialogue interactive, and so if you have any questions at any point, please use the chat function at the side. So I'm sure you've not come to listen to me today, so I'll hand it over to Dr. Josipa Pechenik, who's the President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, who has been doing some really fascinating, interesting work on the field of transit electrification. So I'll hand it over to you, Josipa.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks to the entire team for putting this together. It's an exciting panel as part of the Canada-US Infrastructure Exchange focused on the road to transit electrification. I'm Josipa Pechenik. I'm the President and CEO of QTRIC, as John noted. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists here today who have oodles of expertise. And I think in light of yesterday's Canadian announcement, we all have a reinvigoration of energy to add to this dialogue as well. So we have Leah Odwyer, Head of eBus Infrastructure at ChargePoint, Jeffrey Busby, Director of Infrastructure Program Management at TransLink, David Warren, Director of Sustainable Transportation at New Flyer Industries, Danny Ilioyu, Zero Emissions Fleet Strategic Planning Manager, King County Metro, and Marte Claessens, Principal Commercial Officer for the U.S. Commercial Service of Canada. And so we'll turn first to our panelists for a general overview. And we've got Jeff on the line and Danny with us, and Leah and David on the line with us here. And so we're going to start off with a question to you about where your industry organization is or your transit agency is with regards to electrification today, given that there's lots of money coming, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but where are you today in terms of your electrification innovation, and what are some of your greatest successes? If we can do a quick roundtable on that to set the scene. First, we're going to start off on the transit side of the equation. So Jeffrey, if we don't mind, we're going to go pick on TransLink. Here's one of the larger transit operators in Canada that has actually deployed electric buses and made a big announcement recently about purchasing more of them. So over to you, Jeffrey, for an overview of where you're at today with electrification.
Thanks very much, Josipa. It's great to join you all from the west coast of Canada. TransLink is the regional authority. We deliver transit service to Metro Vancouver, about 2.5 million people that live here. I think it's important that we kind of describe our journey around electrifying our fleet really in the context of what we're trying to achieve broadly around the province's objectives to meet its greenhouse gas emissions targets. Just to give you a little bit of context, per capita in British Columbia, we emit 13 tons of CO2. That comes down to almost half, by about 5.5 tons for residents of Metro Vancouver. And when you get into the core of our urban region, we're less than 4 tons per capita. And I've seen some evidence that the people who live right in the heart of the downtown in Vancouver are a fraction of that. So with that kind of scale, it really points to the importance of transportation and the transportation system, not just in terms of providing a more sustainable, lower carbon transportation choice, but really, when you think about it, fundamentally, we are here to allow the conditions that allow people to live in dense urban places where, on a per capita basis, we can really see significant reductions in emissions. So we at TransLink know that we play an important role in that. I think that's particularly important given the pandemic and all of the discussions about the flight from the city. We think that the cities are where the future will be and where the future needs to be in terms of meeting climate change. We can't rest on the laurels that we are doing good work to allow people to live in cities. We know that our operations are also an important part of the climate puzzle. And we are certainly aware that it is an advantage to our policymakers to direct low carbon and electrification initiatives on the publicly owned fleet, because they don't have to influence consumer choice. They really can have a direct moving the needle on electrification. So our journey is actually well underway with our colleague in Puget Sound in King County. We have a fleet of electric trolley buses that have been operating since they were converted from electric streetcars. So we have 266 vehicles in our fleet of almost 1,700 buses that are electric. That's about 16%. But the balance of our vehicle fleet is really where we're seeing the opportunity to make significant emissions reductions. We have a long-term target of 80% reductions by 2050. We know that we need to actually speed up if we're going to meet broader targets. So we're engaged in a process right now to set interim targets. What that means for us is that we would hope to replace about 500 plus buses over the remainder of this decade. And it's our objective at TransLink that we do not purchase additional diesel buses, that all replacement buses are electric. And so we've been starting that journey with the help of QTRIC, with the help of our colleagues around North America. We've got a pilot that's been underway for about a year. We've just expanded that pilot to fully electrify a single route. And as I said, we've got about 19 battery buses on order and in deployment, and we've got about 500 to go. So it's a big task to really scale that up with the objective of really driving down emissions as part of this bigger story around the role of transit in sustainability.
That's fantastic, Jeffrey. And, you know, rolling out of that and all of that experience that you went in as early leaders at TransLink, one of the biggest systems in the country. Of course, yesterday's announcement of about $15 billion over several years, of which $3 billion a year from 2026 onward, presumably tied to only zero emissions bus technology. That's a huge injection of investment. We know your agency was looking for that. So we're going to circle back to find out how that injection of investment affects the deployment plans. With that, over to you, Danny. From the experience in the United States, a lot more regulatory requirement in past years to move, whether you wanted to or not, you had to. That stateside experience has really furnished a lot of evidence for Canadian systems to build off of, but it hasn't been easy. So can we get a sense, Danny, from lessons learned and where you're at with electrification in King County?
Yeah, so we're in a very exciting space. We're kind of like a version 2.0 right now. We've been operating 11 battery electric buses for almost 5 years now. These are small battery packs, short range, opportunity charging buses, but they've given us the ability to learn as an organization how to transition more into battery electric buses as a potential tool for us to provide our service. We operate in King County. We're headquartered in Seattle. So we have 39 municipalities that we serve in the King County area. So we have pretty large geographic area. We operate Link Light Rail. We operate 2 streetcar systems for the city of Seattle. And in our fleet, we also have 174 electric trolley buses, similar to the ones that Jeffrey has in his operation at TransLink. And those are also zero emission buses. They have batteries on board. They have lithium batteries for off-wire operation. So again, taking all of these pieces from our organization has allowed us to have a collection of staff with a good, strong experience in terms of operating electric vehicles in general. So that allowed us, we took all of those inputs, we took inputs from various parts of the organization and affected groups. And we've developed a program that right now is in the first phases of constructing a test facility. So this test facility that we're building right now, and we started construction last month, which is pretty exciting. We hope to finish it by this summer. This facility is going to install chargers from 3 different manufacturers. It's going to have both overhead pantograph down chargers as well as plug-in chargers. And we are coupling that with 40 buses that we're purchasing from New Flyer, from David Warren's organization, 20 standard 40-footers and 20 articulated 60-footers. That's very exciting for us because it's going to allow us to take these buses and work with these 3 charger manufacturers in order to fine-tune interoperability so we can move to the next steps. So this is very exciting for us. It's a very exciting phase. This year, I think, is going to be really interesting because we're going to start taking delivery of the buses as well as the infrastructure. And then we're going to invite our colleagues from TransLink and other partner agencies around Canada and the United States, so we can share the lessons that we learned and what were some of the challenges, what were some of the opportunities that we leveraged, and how we're able to deliver these kind of projects. And again, very exciting time, and thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor.
That's fantastic, Daniel. We're going to come back to understanding the challenges ahead, given so much investment of time in the past. What are the next big challenges to overcome in mass fleet deployment? We've got the political will now, it seems like, on both sides of the border, but that doesn't make the technological stuff just happen overnight. So we'll come back to that, and let's turn to the technologists on the panel. Leah, I'm going to turn to you first. So if you don't mind taking us into the readiness of ChargePoint from the charging system standpoint.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. And yeah, it's also great to be here. It's a privilege and an honor. It's always nice to share some experiences. Indeed, we've had many, all of us on the call, some of those experiences together in this industry as we give way to a new way of fueling public transit. And, you know, it's very interesting if you think about where the industry started and where we are today, and I think where we're going to go. And yesterday's announcement underpins that this is not going to happen on this technology cycle. So it's very exciting, but not without its challenges. And part of what we've addressed at ChargePoint over the last 3 or 4 years is to be ready for that industry, ready for it from a point of view of integrated networks. We're a networking company, we're a software company at our core, but also to have the hardware that allows those networks to maximize all of the system inputs being the energy, being the vehicle resources, and so forth. So we spent a lot of time developing the solution and then the ecosystem around that. So while the charger, a lot of people think about the vehicle, then a lot of people might think about the charger, but it's how all those elements sit together in an ecosystem. And that starts at the front end in terms of supporting the customer, educating in some cases, especially smaller agencies. Nobody has all the right answers, and I think no answer is wrong right now. No technology is even necessarily wrong, but each have their advantages and disadvantages. Certainly the support from the federal government has been a huge help in the North American market, in the US market, and now obviously going to be as well in the Canadian market. And that allows people to start in an industry where the buses are expensive, the chargers are new, and they're also expensive. So we have a lot of focus on the total cost of ownership, but it's hard to sometimes display that in small pilot projects. So the funding that has been available has been very good for running pilot programs. We've seen you've been involved in a lot of those, Yosvia, in Tree Organization in Canada, and there's been a lot of those in the United States as well. So at ChargePoint, we focused on developing the building blocks of the ecosystem, starting in the front end with education, consulting, modeling, going through then to the design of the site. Again, all very important attributes that, you know, up to today, transit agencies didn't have to worry too much about things like that. And suddenly where you place the chargers, how you get cables to them, those all become now issues that must be considered. And where the vehicles are parked, which vehicles are parked in which position, and so forth. So there's new considerations there. So we try to help our customers work through that. And then, of course, the chargers themselves, a lot of time, effort, and energy expended on developing new modular DC architecture, which can be distributed out over buses that are connected. And by distributing the charging, we're able to reduce the overall capacity requirements on the system. So therefore, maximizing the available capacity, but keeping that capacity low. And every distributed system that's able to save on chargers, saves on maintenance, saves on the cost of the capital goods, and then saves downstream in terms of service and maintenance. And that feeds into that whole total cost of ownership. Then because These are all networked. We're able to operate or provide comprehensive service and maintenance on the back end, which again is important. This is critical infrastructure. It needs to be kept up. But again, defining all of those programs, pulling all that together is quite a big piece of work. And agencies today that are running 100 buses out of a garage, or 200 or 300 from a depot, they need those buses, whether they're electric or whether they're fossil fuel, to be available for passenger service. So having all the supports in place to be able to do that and support that is something else that we spend a lot of time and effort in. And then there's the integration on the back end, all the different platforms, all the different systems. The obvious stuff is telematics and routing systems, but there's also integration to the grid, and figuring out, the cost of energy, the cost of power, and trying to optimize that. So it's an integrated solution. We've been busy since I joined ChargePoint 4 years ago, working on that, getting some pilot projects on the road in the US and in Canada, and then continuing to build out the business. So yeah, it's an exciting place to be. And I think there's, we could have one of these events every week because there's so much information to share and so many experiences that we can help each other with.
And I think, Leah, that you have the same experience we have, which is over the last few years, it was like we were pulling, trying to convince everybody it's a big systems overhaul. It's not a bus replacement, it's big systems overhaul. And now it's almost like we pulled and the ball skipped over. Now we're being pulled with the movement forward. So you feel like you're running to catch up to the movement you created across the transit and industrial sector. So we're going to come back to you for some of those insights about the challenges of a systems overhaul. The money and the will is there now, but again, the technology requires an entire energy systems overhaul. Very challenging for transit agencies to do on their own. With that, we're going to then segue into what connects to the fuel supply. So the fuel supply is a bunch of electrons. You need the vehicles obviously operating out there on the out the door. We have New Flyer providing every kind of platform you could imagine across Canada and the United States for low and zero emissions, having a lot of lessons learned. So David, I'm going to turn to you if you can take us through where's New Flyer in terms of readiness for electrification, but maybe the next generation of electrification, if you can allude to that.
Yes, thank you, Josepa. Once again, David Warren, I'm Director of Sustainable Transportation at New Flyer, and I hail Seattle as my home, just like Danny, and close to Jeff up in Vancouver. So my company is based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba, as most of you know, and I oversee our Vehicle Innovation Center in Anniston, Alabama. So I used to travel extensively, not so much right now, hopefully in the near future, not to the same level, but very happy to work with this panel. And I'll start by saying that when I first met Leah and Danny, we were involved with infrastructure and charging early on in the SAE standards. And I think all of us recognized how important it was that we needed to create a product that was interoperable, that could share the ecosystem across various agencies and applications. So early on, when the standards were beginning, Leah, Danny, and I worked together on various committees, and were successful in creating some of these standards with the help of Josepa and Qtrick. That has evolved into some very successful projects and unique projects, including TransLink up in British Columbia, Vancouver more specifically, where we've been able to prove that we can use charging systems from multiple manufacturers across multiple original equipment manufacturers, such as New Flyer. So a very successful program. I also want to mention too that, as part of zero emissions, at New Flyer, we are also involved in fuel cell electric buses. And that technology has progressed very rapidly. And with companies such as Hydrogenics and Ballard, there's been some substantial gains made in fuel cell electric buses, thanks to the Canadian, content that has gone on with that. We now have about 27 fuel cell buses of recent vintage distributed in Southern California at Orange County and Sunline, which is in Palm Springs, and AC Transit in Northern California. So, we're very excited about what's progressing electric vehicles. Jeff, I noticed that you have a background with CTA, Chicago Transit Authority. We actually launched our battery electric bus with CTA back in the 2013 timeframe. I'm not sure if you were there at that time frame, but we've since obviously expanded our offerings all over the continent, and very proud of that with Chicago Transit Authority being one of our lead customers. So one of my responsibilities, and I'll end on this, Josipa, is that I have responsibility for infrastructure solutions at New Flyer. And it's interesting, when we first got started in this business, boy, I tell you, it goes back to the time I worked with Danny when Danny was at New York City Transit. And boy, I went through some tough lessons with what it takes to install infrastructure in a major city such as New York, and especially in Manhattan. So a great learning experience. I think we've come a long way since then. But and then Leah, you were involved in that project with another life at that time. But really appreciate your efforts there too. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
Nope. With that, thank you, Josipa. I look forward to questions as we continue.
Well, that's fantastic, because there's a lot of empirical evidence that has come out of the New Flyer deployments that everybody can learn from in terms of the next steps. So I'm going to go right into a couple questions for the transit agencies, and then we're going to come back to the industry partners on the bus and charging side. So for our transit agency partners, I'll start first with yourself, Danny, and then come to Jeff. In terms of the deployments that you've faced so far, as we all know, systems overhaul, really challenging. Theoretically, electric buses should save us money over diesel, potentially over CNG, depending on where you live and how much that costs. But there's a lot of upfront costs and a lot of complexities that end up costing money and chopping into those savings, right? So over the next 5 years, where do you see the cost savings arising, and what has to happen for King County to get to the most efficient deployment, like to overcome the big challenges of those big infrastructure complexities that happen when you first start to adopt technology?
I mean, it's a very interesting concept, looking at cost of ownership and looking at cost of infrastructure. I'm going to first rewind back a little bit. Over 20 years ago, we made the transition from straight diesel buses to diesel electric hybrid buses, and that required additional investment at the vehicle level, but it also required a little bit of infrastructure investment. And as an agency at King County Metro, we decided that that's good for our customers to move the technology into a place where we can provide the same transportation from point A to point B, but in a vehicle that's forward-looking, that's looking to a future that's going to take us to that path of zero emissions eventually. So we made that investment. Early in 2020, we retired our last straight diesel bus. So we no longer have pure diesel buses in our fleet. We only have diesel electric hybrids, electric trolley buses, and battery electric. We've also mentioned the earlier order from New Flyer of 40 additional battery electric buses, and going forward, there may be some small exceptions for purchasing diesel electric hybrids, but those are going to be the exception, not the rule. So the rule is going to be, we are going to move to transition our fleet. So transit agencies are going to have to start changing how they think, and that's like one of the major challenges with transitioning to battery electric buses for us, or for TransLink, or for other agencies for playing with the fuel cell buses, if that's the technology that works for them. the major challenge is going to be a cultural shift, a cultural change. As transit agencies, as bus operators, we're going to have to learn to operate more like our friends in the rail industry, where we have this heavy, long life and long-term investments in infrastructure. And working with partners like Leah and ChargePoint and other charger manufacturers, what we're trying to figure out is how do we make these investments strategically so that we don't end up with stranded assets. And if we do invest in certain things, like we did with the Proterra buses that we got about 5 years ago, that we can extract maximum value from them, even though they may not be the technology of the future. Understanding that once those vehicles get retired, we may have to repurpose some of the equipment. So I think that investments in infrastructure, investments in this transition to a zero emissions fleet is something that initially you're going to see in the forward-looking cities and cities that are considered themselves world-class cities that want to provide world-class transportation to their residents. But eventually, I think it's going to be the norm. So if you fast forward to 2040, 2050 and beyond, I think it's going to be expected that if you move into a world-class city, you're going to have this world-class transportation system. And so unlike the past 70, 75 years where we looked at diesel buses in terms of dollars and cents and how do we get every penny out of the operating system, I think with zero emission vehicles, we're going to initially focus on the transition. So I don't think in the next 5 years, we're going to be expecting any kind of major savings. I think we're going to be expecting some investments in infrastructure, investments in staff. Some agencies are going to have to make larger investments in preparing their staff to work with this new infrastructure and the new vehicles. And then we're going to have to change the way we think about bus service. So you're not going to replace one for one a diesel bus with a battery electric bus or with a fuel cell bus necessarily. However, you can provide the same level of service with the same number of vehicles if you rethink the way you do business. So again, that's going to require another investment in your scheduling staff and your scheduling tools that are currently designed for diesel buses and optimized for diesel buses. You're going to have to work with those suppliers and those vendors to redesign those tools to optimize them, for example, in our case, for battery electric buses. So I hope I answered your question. Yep. And didn't take it down too many rabbit holes, but it's a very exciting period. I think the next 5 years is going to be very exciting, and watching how organizations tweak all of the different parts of an organization in order to better understand how to take advantage of this new technology.
Yeah, Danny, I don't think you took us down a rabbit hole at all. You took us down a pathway that of a discussion we have to have, and this has come up many times, which is if we're serious about transit electrification, presumably because we want to save the planet and give people a better ride, then we probably need to be serious about transit. And in so many cities and jurisdictions, we're actually not serious about transit yet for world-class cities. We don't have dedicated laneways. We don't have the kind of variable fleet that we need. And we don't have the pricing mechanisms in place to get people out of their cars and into transit. So it's a bigger discussion, I think, you've opened up about, are we serious about transit first and foremost, which then leads us to be serious about transit electrification initiatives. And Jeff, I'm going to turn to you because TransLink is in Vancouver, probably one of the most serious about transit cities. Nonetheless, Vancouver itself has had a history of not always having, the transit plans deployed like Toronto that the citizens might want to see. So being serious about transit and now serious about transit electrification, with your experience of complexity in deploying the first round, what has to happen in the next 5 years to get to cost savings plus efficient, great transit of the future that's electrified, as Danny pointed out?
I mean, these are challenging issues. I think that the business case for electrification, in terms of the dollars and cents, is going to be different in different jurisdictions depending on context. In our context, we have the benefit of quite low electric rates and really clean electricity. Most of our power in the province is hydroelectric. And so for us, that means that we are pretty confident that we will see direct savings in avoiding fuel purchase and replacing it with the battery buses. The trade-off, of course, as you've heard across the panel, is that it's no illusion that the upfront investment is quite high, both in the charging infrastructure and the vehicles themselves. You know, the analogy that I give with my colleagues when they ask why are these battery buses the cost that they are, is that when you buy a new diesel bus, it arrives with a gas tank filled with air. That costs nothing. When you buy a new battery bus, you are buying incredibly high technology batteries and all that comes with it. So that is an important reality. I think the other important reality for us is that even accounting for fuel, accounting for the purchase costs, accounting for the infrastructure, still, and in the future, the most expensive part of bus operations is the salary of the driver sitting in the front of those buses. So much of our practice, and you heard Danny allude to that, much of our practice in the transit agency is very finely optimizing our schedules to absolutely keep driver costs to a minimum. The challenge, of course, with the introduction of these new technologies is that what is optimal in terms of designing services for driver shifts is not necessarily supported by the range of the buses. And so this is a trade-off. This is an issue that we have to work through. Our electrification plan is actually counting on improvements in range and improvements in cost to actually allow us to achieve the ultimate objectives that we've set out. We think that the industry is on the right trajectory there, but there will be a delicate balancing act in these initial deployments. One thing that I think we do have in our favor, and certainly yesterday's announcements at the federal level emphasizes this, is that we have strong support from senior government for the upfront capital cost investments. I don't think that TransLink is unique. This is an issue with many transportation agencies, but while we are very fortunate to have these upfront capital investments and support from senior government, we are responsible for the day-to-day operations and maintenance costs. Regional revenues and our fares are what are keeping that going. And so making sure that we can successfully deploy these without really ramping up the ongoing operations and maintenance costs of the buses is that kind of central tension. I think the other thing I would add is that we have at TransLink been in a period of fairly substantial growth. Since about 2016, through the start of the pandemic, we were increasing service, growing our fleet, and running more service as a result to keep up with growing demand for our services. That was in many ways in direct competition with initiatives to reduce the emissions associated with our fleet. So if there's a silver lining to the pandemic and the really significant drop off in demand, it may be that it'll allow us to catch up a little bit in terms of cleaning up putting in place the infrastructure, cleaning up the services that we offer, so that when we're back in expansion mode, when hopefully that returns, that we're on a better path. That's a really important consideration for us because, as you heard from Danny, each diesel bus that's retired is not replaced with a single battery bus. There's additional buses required because of the current range limits, which is definitely putting pressure on our overall capacity to store, operate, and maintain these vehicles.
And actually, Jeff, you point to something that we've seen occur over and over, and I think more agencies are coming to accept it. You know, years ago, we heard from agencies, you got to get to this one-to-one bus replacement, ideally charging at the depot. That's kind of gone by the wayside. And what we've tried to do with transit agencies is help them understand through just the physics of it that, you know, the system might have to come halfway too. Like the technology won't be able to solve it all. The system has to come halfway. But part of that system is difficult. It includes labor hours. It includes how many drivers and your schedule, and it can include your whole block structuring, where you go, what communities you serve, and whether it's a 40-foot, a 60-foot, or a small shuttle right cutaway. So those are not easy problems to solve overnight, but they do require systems overhauls. Having said that, it's a good segue over to our industry partners. We're going to go to a couple questions with Leah and David, and then turn to questions from the audience because there's oodles of them already piling up. To the query on the industry side, I mean, you folks, you can innovate your technology as much as you want. I mean, David, you might discover some magical solid state battery for, $5 a kilowatt hour and brings down the price of the vehicles. But that still doesn't overcome all of the challenges associated with these systems issues, like how many drivers, what the route designs are, and the fact that probably battery and hydrogen fuel cell buses will never be a perfect one-to-one replacement in all cases with labor as it exists today. So from the industry standpoint, what do you think needs to change ideally in order to get your technologies out on the road more effectively? You know, given that you can only change and innovate your technology so much on the manufacturing side. So we'll start there, David. All the examples you've seen, all the deployments, what would you love to see if transit agencies could do or government could do to support the deployment of technologies as they are today?
Yeah, great question, Josipa. I would say I would start with workforce development. You know, obviously with electrification, you know, the electric bus technology is relatively simple, but the skills of the workforce have to change considerably. So an example I would give is software control for the vehicle. You know, with being able to provide chargers from Leah's company, ChargePoint, or Siemens, or ABB, everybody's got different software. And, you know, even though we have standards in place, they interpret the, you know, the industry interprets the standards a little bit different. So you have to have a good handshake in the ecosystem between the bus and the charger. So, and that requires the technician skills to understand, you know, is the vehicle of the right software level? Is a charger of the right software level? And then being able to actually, you know, to check these vehicles with the diagnostic tools, which, you know, it's completely different than, you know, the old days where there was more emphasis on the mechanical work that was going on with the vehicles than perhaps the diagnostics that goes on, and then the troubleshooting between various issues. So I really think workforce development is going to be a huge factor in the success of zero emission deployments. And I think we're making a lot of progress, but there's still a lot more that has to be done in that area.
So we've got labor force innovation in terms of training and readiness, but then on top of it, in situ, in real time, the integration of software controls, the automation of the entire process, all those accoutrements that really advanced manufacturing is used to, but analog transit operations are not. And so it's the merging of those two experiences.
Yeah, and one other comment I'd like to add too is that the importance of this as automated vehicles or AV vehicles are starting to be deployed, including at New Flyer. You know, the amount of data and diagnostics that are on the buses, they have to communicate with items like the chargers or the grid is just, you know, tremendous. And so whether it's connected vehicles or automated vehicles or the electrification of these vehicles, you know, there's so many things that have to be synchronized and worked out. And the technician is going to be the key, working with the engineers to make sure that that happens.
And now, you know, that's a nice segue over to you, Leah, for final word on this. What needs to happen on the transit system side to enable the technology of today to have greater effect? You know, given that you deal with the charging system, it's everything that includes not just getting the electron to the bus, but the energy storage, the smart charging controls, the demand management, all of those pieces that no transit agency, unless they operate subways or streetcars, actually has like a horde of electrical engineers to manage. And even when you do subways and streetcars, it's not the same technical knowledge of energy storage integrated with a transformer with the grid. So lots of systems overhauls. What has to happen at transit to get your technology to electrify more today? Over to you, Leah.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, so it's a really challenging one. And when I started out in e-mobility back in, well, a long time ago, 2008, 2009, people used to talk, grown men and women used to talk about the chicken and egg. And initially I thought these people are crazy, but over time, of course, I realized exactly that, you know, what they meant. And that was the whole thing of the car and the infrastructure, but it applied to many parts and many facets of this industry. And I've heard the chicken and egg mentioned a few times recently again. And I mean, it's hard, where to start. So I think one of the major challenges that the transit agencies face is there's so much information. And, you know, David, he mentioned 10 or 15 things in what he said, or if he mentioned 10 things, there's 5 subsets that those of us in the industry understand and know what he means. But when you're looking at this with fresh eyes from outside and from the traditional transit industry, it's a really confusing landscape. So, and David's right, all those integrations need to happen together. So in the way that, you know, for the overhead charging, which wasn't that difficult, we had a standard we set up in SAE, which David referenced earlier, and we got, you know, a coalition of the willing together. It's almost like we need something like that for the, I mentioned earlier about the ecosystem, to somehow define what it needs to be, not specifically, because you need, you know, competitive, you know, scenarios between independent providers, but you also need sort of broad envelopes or boxes that the different pieces can fit into together. One of the things we're starting to see now is multiple vendors involved in a single project. So you have somebody providing, you know, software to do some element of the management, somebody else then doing telematics, somebody else doing the charger, somebody else managing the charger, somebody else obviously providing the buses, and so on. And then upstream of that, there's even more systems within transit operations. So it becomes a very complex environment. So I think some type of standardization around that would certainly help. And it would also, I think, help with procurement, because right now, I don't know how agencies can really procure and feel they're getting the best, not just, well, obviously the best value, but the best value over the life of the project, because there's so many competing almost ideologies and ideas. So it's like there needs to be a sort of set of first principles. These are the, you know, the absolutes that you must have. And things like connectors, that's, you know, now that's well sorted at this stage. But even on overhead, there's, you know, there's still some, you know, and even in the standardization, we ended up having to come up with compromises. But it's like there needs to be sort of first principles around core pieces. And almost a best practice for those types of things. I think that would help greatly with procurement, and that would help greatly with the value that the agencies are getting. And Danny's right, there's going to be investment and there's going to be spend over the next, you know, 5, even 10 years, and significant investment. But it really, it beholds everybody that's involved in the industry to make sure that that's, you know, investment in the right place, because we're all in this industry and we ultimately want to see harmful, you know, fossil fuel vehicles taken off the road and replaced with zero emission transit buses. So I would say that it's a few things around the technology to somehow stream, standardize, create best practices that would make it easier for operators to be able to procure. And then that itself would feed into the procurement and the evaluation of suppliers and technologies. And I think it would also maybe help with business models, because, you know, as long as the federal governments or state agencies or large cities are funding initiatives like this in North America and around the world, it's good and it allows the industry to start. But at some point in time, the industry will have to be viable on its own. So there may be a need to look at new business models, because you have revolutionary thinking in some places where maybe transit should be free in order that people would use transit. But then if transit is free, it has to be efficient, because ultimately it has to be paid for. There is no such thing as a free lunch, as we know. So again, thinking about the transitions that they're done in a very worthwhile way, in a sustainable way, using the best technology, but also using it in a way that makes sense and that provides value to the transit riders, the transit operators, and creates a good competitive supply base in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Leah, you've landed on a key point, because I think you've summarized up in a lot of variables exactly what David was saying, as well as Jeff and Danny, which is this is a huge amount of new knowledge, and it's got to get into our brains really quickly at the transit agency level. And that means some new staff, but also means retraining existing staff. And then it means trying to get our public sector decision makers to really privilege transit as a whole system deployment, right? A lot going on there. I'll segue to questions from the audience now, just by saying we've had the funny kind of scenario that I agree with you. I think there's still some ideology left in the industry. I did my PhD in a mathematical field. I'll never understand being ideological about things like power level, like how much energy gets to your bus at what power level. I don't really understand that. It's probably a gap in my own brain, but it's like being ideological about the real number system versus the natural number system. They're mechanisms for achieving something. I wonder often whether people got tethered to certain solutions years ago, and there's a bit of pride. There's a bit of pride still stuck to some of those solutions, and we got to culturally tweak that out through the empirics of reality. So let's get over to the questions from the audience. I'm going to ask for the speakers to go to 1-minute rapid fire answers. We've got a couple questions here from Desi Stefanova. Her first question was just on the funding piece that I had mentioned, 3 billion per year after 2026, about 15 billion overall, but 3 billion per year in stable funding in Canada for transit. That was announced by the Canadian federal government, led by Minister Catherine McKenna, who's been a huge advocate of this when she was Minister of Environment and now Minister of Infrastructure. But it was announced by her with the Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister yesterday. So we're all looking to details about that to come. But Desi has the question of what do you think about on the technology side, open standards for chargers? So for that, David, I'm going to turn to you. Could we move to open standards for chargers? Would that improve the situation, reduce cost, and make things move faster? Or is it now too far down the road? And there are standards and they're sufficient.
I don't know if I have the best answer for this. Maybe Leah could chime in after I respond. But, you know, the standards are you know, there's room, I think, for open standards, but the details that go behind these standards for charging are incredibly technically oriented, and you know, requires an organization like the Electric Power Research Institute or the Society of Automotive Engineers to really dive into the details that go along with these standards and utilize their technical experts to weigh in on this. But you know, I think there is room for some work on open standards, but it has to be really done with the technical community highly involved.
Yeah, and maybe David, if I can ask Leah for your insight there, because per your point, David, like these technical standards are very engineering focused, and we advance the idea of like J3105 standardization, interoperability, but a standard on a piece of paper is different from the standard actually functioning when you get it out there in real life. And Leah, you've probably been on the front lines of quite a bit of that. So the question was like, is there a role for open standards here to reduce cost? Are we beyond that? And there's other needs really.
I think we're beyond that in terms of most of the technical standards now. And when you consider that the life cycle of the vehicle is, you know, 12, 15 years. I was on a call this morning earlier today with a customer in Europe, and they asked that very question about connectors. Is there a risk that the connectors, you know, could become obsolete? And it's like, well, the vehicles are going to be there for 12 years. So the charger will be there for 12 years, and depending on maintenance, perhaps another several years after that. But the connector isn't going to be irrelevant for 12 years. So I think the standards are pretty much baked in now. And if you think of the development time for vehicles and for the power, you know, the controllers and the battery systems and power electronics, I think most of that's bedded in. So we've had an interesting time getting these various systems to work together. And I think that's probably because the original standards were, let's say, you know, they were open to interpretation in terms of the connection between the vehicle and the infrastructure. But for sure there, and I touched on it a moment ago, about the need for other areas of standards, particularly around the way the data is managed. And currently today we see that we have things like the open charge point protocol, but then we have equipment that's more sophisticated than the protocol was designed around. And again, the protocol has been there for a while, and while that certainly has improved as well and moved over time, it's interesting to wonder how much of a roadblock will we have around the data and managing all of that information in the future. And if we start to think about, even partially autonomous vehicles inside the depot, how much information are they going to how much information is going to stream off those vehicles as people start to look at charging, we're combining en route charging and depot charging, and they want to take real-time telematics off hundreds and hundreds of vehicles in an urban area and make decisions as to whether they should return back to base, taking into account deadhead, driver schedules, things like that. How is all that going to be managed? So what I think you could see is people innovating locally. So, maybe I go and talk to Danny and King County, do something, and we have a unique situation there, and someone else goes to New York and someone else goes to Paris. And I mean, I think there is a role for open standards, and there is an activity, I think, to be had within the industry to figure that out. But there's a lot of questions out there, but I think the role of data and information in the future is going to be key to how all of this is stitched together to create that seamless operating experience.
So taking from the idea that we really don't have the standards piece sorted out on the data collection, the data integration, then even the calibration across telemetry devices, that is also an open question, let alone the plugging in of this entire system into the grid, and what is the standard for all the cybersecurity that needs to protect our grid on that system. Lots of standards to be developed. With that, we're going to segue into the next question from JJ Sam, and this is for Jeffrey and Danny. This one speaks to the issue of next technologies. So you're just getting caught up with electrification. Now everybody wants to know about autonomous buses, autonomous and connected shuttles, the next generation of electrified zero emissions vehicles. To the point that Leah noted, there's also not standards necessarily for all the vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure commonality for transit applications. So the question from JJ Sam is, what needs to be in place for autonomous electric buses? I'm going to ad-lib a little bit, JJ, on your question. And what considerations for implementation of these autonomous electric buses need to be made within the current wave of investment? I say that noting that in the federal announcement yesterday, it was about ZEBs, differential cost system deployments. It did not include reference to DSRC units, building out 5G networks, any of those accoutrements needed for automated platooned electric buses, which we'd all love to see, I'm sure. So Jeff, over to you for TransLink's view on this. What has to happen for AV buses to be viable? What are the next electric bus deployments with those kinds of technologies for TransLink?
The distinct privilege in discussions about autonomous vehicles working in Metro Vancouver. We have 3 rail lines that have been operating, the original one since 1985, fully electric, fully autonomous. One is running right outside my office here. So this is not a new technology. Obviously, this is something that the transportation industry is familiar with. As you can appreciate, expanding that beyond the very controlled system of our light metro out into the world brings on a whole host of complexities. To be really frank around this, our focus is on making sure that we're providing transportation service that meets the needs of our community, that is sustainable. I think at the moment, we see the electrification of our buses as kind of a primary thrust of our work there. Any further deployments around fully automated stuff is likely going to be on our rail side. I think there is a missed opportunity in the transportation industry for broader deployment of automated rail systems in North America. It's a bit disappointing to me to see more and more deployment of rail systems that are still not taking full advantage of what I think is a global phenomenon there. So you asked me for a 60-minute answer, and I avoided it by talking about our SkyTrain system.
Right. Well, it's a fair point to raise that AV tech is not new to the industry, certainly not at TransLink. And we do have a lot of rail operators keen on operating AV buses. And we now have New Flyer with a prototype AV bus out there. And the dream is platooned autonomous electric buses on rapid transit ways, so you don't have to build out LRT, but you have zero emissions LRT style deployment. You know, that's the dream. It's feasible, but just not close nearby. So over to you, Danny, from an electric bus standpoint, you've just come over the hump. What's the next big thing on that AV tech side for electric buses?
Yeah, so I think to sort of close out the automation conversation, I think in most large transit agencies, it's not going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. It makes absolutely no sense. It's not something that's needed. It's sort of like one of these things that's a solution that's looking for a question. You're dealing with, if you go to TransLink or you go to my agency, King County Metro, you're looking at professional drivers. And you're looking at professionally trained drivers, and they work in a very restricted geographic area, and they know the nuances of the road, the patterns of people. They know, and they process so much information and so much external stimuli that you cannot fine tune an automation system to provide any kind of benefit in the near future. It just doesn't make any sense. My drivers deal with animals crossing the road, children playing on the street, elderly people taking their time crossing the street, people with vision issues stepping into traffic and stuff like that, trying to get across the street. People that are driving cars that are impaired, they're actually more dangerous, I think, to the whole ecosystem than anybody else. So the problem is not with my professional bus drivers. You know. So anyway, that's my little soapbox on automation. Unlike on the rail side, you don't own and maintain your roadway or your right of way. I know there's going to be some headway made there where we're going to have more dedicated bus lanes. But those are going to have to be shared with emergency vehicles and with other customers, if you will. So that's where that's going. Where the EV technology is going to go next is, I think it's pretty simple. We've already done a study. 70% of my service can be replaced 1-for-1 with existing battery electric bus technology. I don't have to change my scheduling. I don't have to change anything. I don't have to change driver training. I don't have to change anything. The existing technology, I go to David, I buy the buses from him, and they can support 70% of my existing service. The other 30% is going to have to be solved. And we have very smart technical people that can solve this. And I guess, Josipa, you having studied math, I think you probably innately understand the optimization problems that can be brought to bear using all of the data and the technology that you heard Leah and David talk about earlier. There is a tremendous amount of data coming from these vehicles. There are already standards in place for communications networks on vehicles and all that stuff. So again, people that work for David's organization are experts in that because they bring together transmissions and engines and electric propulsion systems and hybrid propulsion systems and fuel cell systems. And somehow they're able to package them on a vehicle. So obviously they have enough standards in place where they can put these Legos together and make something that looks like a bus and works like a bus. And it's out there for about 12 years delivering service. So yes, they're getting more complicated. Technology is, it always changes. And in some things, it makes our life a lot easier. And today we have extremely reliable buses. We have engines and transmissions that we don't touch for years. And we look at a simple battery electric bus, and I think David might have mentioned that earlier. It's a simple vehicle. It's batteries, inverters, and traction motors. So it's pretty much as simple as what you find on the rail side. And the components are similar. And Leah worked with Siemens before, and sure she saw a lot of technology being able to transfer at the company like Siemens from one part of the organization to another in order to solve problems. So again, we have very intelligent technical people working on these problems. We're going to have slight improvements in battery capacity. We don't need high charge power rates, so we have to be careful of that rabbit hole. You know, the initial intent is I want 1 megawatt charge power rates, or I want 2 megawatt charge power rates. If you can afford to do that with your top of the line Tesla or Porsche, whatever latest model is, and you have those kind of funds, then by all means, look at that technology and those power levels. But I think for the average customer, you're going to see that, again, optimizing to use the least amount of power that you could possibly get away with in order to perform the task that you pay to do. And that's really where savings that you were talking earlier, Josipa, come from, those dollars and cents, those optimization problems, and using the technology and using the data that Leah was talking about, and getting the analytical tools. And we have artificial intelligence that we can now bring to bear using learning tools, so we can look at that data and see how it patterns and see how we can optimize it so we can more efficiently operate these vehicles. Right. Eventually, we should be able to buy a smaller battery. Eventually, the goal is, Jeffrey and myself, we don't want to go to David and say, what's the biggest battery size? I can afford that. Give me the biggest battery because that's going to give me the biggest range. Ideally, we're going to come to a point where we're not going to do that. We're going to go to some part of our software solution set who's going to say, Danny, you need a 275 kilowatt hour battery. Jeffrey, you need a 325 kilowatt hour battery for your service in your system. Mm-hmm. So that's the excitement that I see again in the next generation, is starting to collect this data and applying some intelligence to it to start fine tuning and optimizing our systems.
Definitely. So not jumping forward to the whole AV world, let's deal with the innovative gaps we still have in the electrification world. And what you're pointing to, Danny, is a lot of right sizing and bringing that intelligence to the right size in optimization. You know, having said that, I'll just conclude on this. We'll turn to final comments from our colleagues, and I'll call back John Allen to lead us here in a moment with the U.S. Commercial Service and our colleague Martin Claessens to close out this discussion. But on your point, Danny, during my postdoc, one of my supervisors, he analyzed the history of the mathematical theorem that we now today use to describe stall in aircraft. And yet this was the mathematical theorem that a lot of engineers used to describe lift in the early 20th century, which is why a lot of aircraft took off and flipped over and a lot of pilots died. And yet somehow we actually got aircraft to function on incorrect mathematics. And so that just leads to engineers who will make stuff work. We will make stuff work, and we don't necessarily have to have it all perfect, but if we get to an optimized solution, that is the opportunity for all those savings down the road, and that is the exciting part indeed. So with that, I'm going to thank all of the panelists here today. I'm sorry we have run out of time. We had a lot of questions from colleagues like Alex Sang at BC Hydro, who are asking about DC and DC power revolution to go right into the power of the vehicles. That's worth a whole conference on its own. It's a really great, exciting topic. And we had a few other colleagues really asking about the cost of fuel cell electric buses, where that plays in the landscape. I hope we can come back for another panel like this to continue the dialogue, because there's so many questions to have answered. So with that, I want to thank you all as panelists. And I believe we do have closing remarks from our colleague, Martin Claessens, who's the Principal Commercial Officer at the U.S. Commercial Service in Canada, and he spent over a decade in those various roles with the U.S. Commercial Service. We'd like to turn to Martin now for closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for the great discussion. I really enjoyed it. And thanks to Global Public Affairs for inviting me today. As you heard, I'm Martin Claessens, and I represent the U.S. Commercial Service and the U.S. Consulate here in Toronto. It's great to be with you all. My organization helps U.S. companies get into places like Canada and abroad, but we also help Canadian companies access the U.S. market. And really, my message is that we're here to help you all in this great new era of electrification. Our mandate is to promote U.S. exports and to advance U.S. commercial interests, as well as to attract Canadian investment into the United States. So we are opportunity creators. And I know that our Canadian colleagues would agree when I say that there is some great convergence here in interests. As you might have seen, you might not have seen, President Biden recently signed an executive order strongly encouraging the U.S. federal government to buy only zero-emission vehicles, something that just came out very recently. Currently, more than 3,200 of the U.S. federal government-owned vehicles are fully electric, and 1,200 are hybrids. And here in Canada, of course, you all know better than I do, but reducing emissions is a leading driver behind the Canadian government's aim to add 5,000 electric buses to Canada's transit and school fleets by the end of 2024. So as you can see, our countries are very well aligned now in their goal to reduce emissions. I think it provides a unique opportunity for government and business to work together to make sure that the North American market is strong. And we really want to see the North American market kind of lead the world in electrification and electric vehicle manufacturing. So with that, I just want to say thanks again for inviting me here. I want to offer our support for all of the U.S. companies and Canadian companies on the line. And I look forward to working with all of you in the future to make sure that the North American market is strong and we lead the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you to everybody on the line. It was a fantastic panel, lots of great news ahead. At least we can say as of today, money probably shouldn't be the problem anymore in the next 10 years, at least in the US under President Biden and in Canada under Prime Minister Trudeau with Minister Catherine McKenna's support. Hopefully money's not the problem, but we have these other challenges to overcome. I have no doubt the smart brains here on this panel and in our transit industry will overcome. So thank you so much for your time. We look forward to building the future of mobility.